George.
It's Red Femmes!
It's Red Femmes.
Do your homework.
Hi, George.
Hi, Acton.
Hi.
Here we are after a bit of a hiatus. I was away, and then I was sick.
And now you're back and you're well. So
We really spared you last week. I don't think you would have wanted to listen to my voice. Not like you want to listen to my voice anyway, but you know what I mean. It would have been extra gravelly.
yeah.
All right, so finally, we're here to talk about submission. We've been practicing saying his name. Michel Houellebecq.
Michel Houellebecq.
You did it better. French author, Soumission, otherwise known as Submission in English. I have to say, this is the book I've been most reluctant to go on the record about.
Why?
Because I think it's, if you haven't read the book, you know, do the homework, right? This discussion could be very easily misconstrued, and especially since, you know, Islamophobia is a whole thing on the left. It's a third rail now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this book is about, you know, in its own way, it's about the Islamification of the West, or at least the European West of Europe. And yeah, it really has become a third rail. I mean, it's the mainstream issue, like much more mainstream than trans, although of course I hang out in that same rabbit hole too. But there is actually a lot of real concern about mass immigration, both legal and illegal, in Europe, and the cultural change that is brought about by large non-assimilated Muslim communities, groups. And this is actually really happening in France and Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't talk about it really without being labeled far right or an Islamophobe or a bigot. And in Britain, it is like, it comes from the government, that terminology. It's very scary what's happening there because they don't have the First Amendment.
Right.
So they can pass laws saying, you know, if you say these things, we put you in jail. And they're doing that over there. But of course, now I sound like a conspiracy theorist. But the point is, I don't think it's phobic to talk about these things. I mean, Renaud Camus is like probably no one's favorite person. He's sort of like the most glass half empty.
Mm-hmm.
But he's not wrong about, like, for example, in our country, the whole story of Springfield, the Haitians. I mean, obviously it was ridiculous to, you know, make accusations. Like, the whole point of, you know, xenophobia is like, oh, we make these people morally unacceptable. And that's obviously wrong, and it's false.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, the narrative of the left is false too. It is not true that just by stepping onto American soil, even if legally, because these Haitian immigrants are legal immigrants, it's not true that you become magically assimilated. I mean, we used to understand that it took generations to perform assimilation.
Right.
I don't think people take seriously the real sense of, the real value of cultural continuity and the real threat that people feel when they experience real change.
Yeah.
I don't think it's taken seriously enough. I mean, there has to be some ground between, you know, these people are eating our pets, which is disgusting and wrong. But the answer to that can't be anyone who comes here is just as American as you and me, and it doesn't matter how many people from a different culture come to my town feels the same. That's what the left wants you to believe.
Which is not true either.
And that's not true either.
Yeah.
I feel like we need to talk about these things more honestly. So I wanted to get that off my chest.
Yeah.
But, and also another way, we might say that this book really isn't about Islam at all. It's not really about Islamification in the way we might think of it.
Uh-huh.
It seems so on the surface, though. But I think actually it's a book about Europe. It's a book about Western Christianity. And to be in a French context, more specifically, the erosion of Catholicism in France.
Yes.
So the surface story, there's a Muslim Brotherhood Party in France, and it is voted into power democratically to prevent the far right from coming to power. And this would be the real far right person, Marine Le Pen, who inherited, was it her uncle's? What was her father's party? I can't remember. I think maybe her father's. And so massive cultural changes result, including the dismantling of secular education, the legalization of polygamy, the banishment of women from certain professions, including university teaching.
Right.
So we follow these changes through the life of a university professor, Francois, who is brought round to adopting the new state religion, which effectively it is, in order to continue his teaching career. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, one of the sort of like interwoven stories is one of his lovers, which he always finds among his students, because, I mean, this is France and this is the modern world, right? Moves to Israel to escape the rise of anti-Semitism in France. So it kind of seems like a dystopian novel, you might say, in the way of A Handmaid's Tale. But I don't think it really is. Although it has dystopian elements. I mean, women are obviously, it's very pointed, right? This portrayal of women getting the short end of the stick.
Yes.
But it's dystopian, I don't think, about the future. It's dystopian about the present. Because I don't see otherwise how you could explain the purposeful emphasis on the fact that Islam gains political power through entirely democratic means, through free elections, and how it's framed as the only alternative to Nazism in the form of Marine Le Pen's National Front, or how at the novel's end, there's a lot of indications that the Islamification of Europe is basically this sort of almost revival of the Roman Empire. It's seen as this unifying...
Yes.
Like we're all going to be under one political government.
Like Pax Islama. Kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. Pax Islama. There you go. So the dystopian element comes not from these political fantasies, which are, in some way, could be viewed as positive, but from the way that Islam is adopted by the secular libertine subset of men, of which the protagonist is the part. And that's the angle that we get in this book. So we could think about how forms of Islam, both in this novel and more broadly, do treat women badly. I mean, we have the worst examples come to mind, right? Afghanistan or Iran, right? I think we can actually make an argument here that in this context, Islam is used very much as a foil. Yeah. A foil for a commentary about the current state of Western culture that has utterly lost its religious and moral orientation. Yeah. That's why I'm interested in it, because it really is about, as Illich, our favorite Illich quote these days, right? The corruption of the best is the worst.
Yes.
And if Christianity is the best of the West, then its exhaustion or failures or whatever this is the worst, because the thing that's the best, when it goes bad,
it goes really
bad.
Exactly. I think you're right. I think that while the book talks about Islam, it's not about Islam. It's about the corruption of Catholicism that paves the way for the secular reaction and rejection of Christian belief and Christian morals, which itself paved the way for Islam to take root. And it's important to note that this is a French story, not an American one, and French and American versions of secularism are quite different. Like, American secularism was originally about making sure all the different Protestant denominations could coexist in tolerance and that none of them would get established as a state church. But French secularism is about a wholesale rejection of Catholicism as this powerful, public, life-saving entity that had just filled the horizon for everyone for centuries.
It was a state church.
Exactly. So the American Revolution and the French Revolution were not really motivated by the same things. Like, the American colonists were concerned about taxation and representation and having the same rights as their fellow British citizens. But the French Revolution, in addition to being anti-monarchical, it was also a religious revolution. Right? It was a rejection of the Catholic Church and of the priestly class, and its intentional replacement with, the cult of reason and the cult of the supreme being, and these kind of bizarre and short-lived and supposedly rational substitutes for faith. Like, the French revolutionaries destroyed churches, they confiscated church property, they shut down monasteries, they massacred nuns and priests. They tried to create these secular festivals in place of Catholic liturgical festivals. So in the American Revolution, you can make the case that Protestant religious sentiments motivated the colonists' actions, but in France, their revolution was motivated by anti-religious sentiment.
And we have this separation of church and state, but they go further. They have this concept of laïcité, which is the French from what we have the adjective lay, as in not of the clergy.
Laity versus clergy.
Right, laity. So
I didn't know it was from that.
In French is how you say that, and they're huge on it. That's why in France they can do things like ban. You cannot wear headscarves in schools because of laïcité. They're allowed to sort of impose bans against religious expression because of this fervent belief that religious expression in state institutions is dangerous.
Yes, that's so interesting. So the way Islam relates with modern French secularism and the way Islam relates with modern American secularism are not the same. So America is so much more Christian than France is, I think.
Right, and indeed, the discussions we have about immigration here are not about Islam. Like these Haitians, they're Christians.
Right.
That's not the issue. The issue is not religious difference.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, even our most secular progressives are actually carrying the torch of liberal Protestantism, right? They're not really secular. Wokeism is a Christian heresy, I think. Again, like the corruption of the best is the worst. I mean, I think our sort of the progressivism is an aspect of Christian faith and doctrine and morals that has kind of gone off the rails and cut loose from other values and is running wild. So, it's possible that, France is our future, but we're not there yet. And their situation is so far beyond ours because they rejected Christianity in a manner and to a degree that America didn't or hasn't yet. I don't know if we ever will, but Catholics have always been a minority faith in America, and so we're unlikely to really understand the depth of resentment and rage that the French had towards the Roman Catholic hierarchy and its corruption and collusion with the monarchy, because we're the children of Puritans. We're just a different breed from French Catholics. And I think in some way, Protestant and evangelical subcultures are a little bit safer from this kind of post-religious collapse into secularism than Catholic cultures are. And that's because Catholicism actually makes a much bolder and grander claim. Like they say, this is the church, the one true church. It's all right here, and it's always been here. And if faith in that kind of church collapses, it just collapses like a house of cards, I think, suddenly and totally. And that's what happened in France. That's what happened in French-speaking Quebec in the 60s. It went from like ultra-Catholic to ultra-secular overnight. But it's different with Protestants, and especially with evangelicals, and I know this having grown up in it, because they broke away from this vision of the one holy Catholic apostolic church as a visible institution hundreds of years ago. And they kind of inoculated themselves against collapse by breaking themselves into smaller pieces, into tinier denominations, and by making a much smaller and more personal claim. Christianity is about your personal relationship with Jesus. So why don't you come on down to our local church and join us on a Sunday? The claim of identity of what the church is just so much smaller for evangelicals, and it comes kind of pre-dismantled. So there's just less height from which the faith can fall. If you know what I mean? Like they narrow their scope of accountability. Because evangelicals don't really do church history. They just say, well, that's the Catholic's fault. It's not our problem, So they don't make themselves engage with the past and with tradition and with the failures of the past. They travel light. And I know this because I grew up in it. We travel light, and that has some benefits, And I think this accounts for why America has actually been more resistant to religious collapse. Because if everybody is already in a low church rather than a high church setting, you don't have that far to fall.
Is that what that means? Is that probably what
low? I mean, low and
means?
high. I'm kind of using it equivocally, like in a double meaning way. But high church means liturgical, but also having more hierarchy. And low church means more casual, and also more personal, right? And if the past isn't your past, then you don't have to try to make amends because you've decided in advance that it's not your burden to carry. It's not your knot to untangle. And in the case of Britain, the Church of England, as a liturgical state church and kind of a monolith, functioned more like the Catholic Church in that country, even though it's Protestant. And so I don't think that kind of ruins my theory about this.
Well, it was Catholicism with divorce, basically. So
basically, yeah, for the sake of, for the divorce. And to be clear, I'm not trying to necessarily compliment or criticize either Protestantism or Catholicism here, because I've been on both sides of it. I'm just making an observation of how they're different. But I want to mention this because you and I are Americans. I expect most of our listeners are Americans. And while we discuss these issues of Christianity and secularism in the context of modern France, I just want to make sure that we keep these cultural distinctions in mind, because I'm not worried that Sharia law is going to show up in Kansas anytime soon. But it's true that secularism has a time limit. Like, it's going to play itself out. It will spend itself. And the question is, what kind of religion will creep back in and fill the void? When we finally tire of having no rules, whose rules will we choose to live by? What happens after you do you?
And there's definitely something coming after.
Yes. And the question is, how good is that for women and for children, right? And in this book, Submission, Houellebecq gives a very prescient and a really disturbing answer to that question.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a book that you put down at the end and like, ooh.
Yeah, like, ooh, I feel a little sick.
So let's start with a key statement of this end-of-the-line secularism, exemplified by the way Francois' misogyny dovetails with his own refusal to participate in what we used to call a patriarchy, which, I remind our listeners, means rule of the father. It doesn't mean the rule of men.
It's fathers, yeah.
So I think by now it's a term for us, the exhausted patriarchy. Women still hate it, but men can't even be bothered. So this is from near the beginning of the book, where Francois is talking with Miriam, So that, because she's going to leave for Israel and she's just going to decide not to come back. And by the way, that is a real thing. Like in recent years, Jewish immigration to Israel from France has been on the rise because of fear or experience of anti-Semitic terrorism in France.
Yes.
And that is coming largely, I mean, of course, the left as a whole embraces this sort of like ideology, this very anti-Israel ideology, but it's obviously a lot of it is coming from Islamic communities.
Right.
In France. Okay. So Francois is the narrator, so it's his voice. Miriam turned to face me. You don't mind me calling you macho, do you? I don't know. I guess I must be kind of macho. I've never really been convinced that it was a good idea for women to get the vote, study the same things as men, go into the same professions, etc. I mean, we're used to it now, but was it really a good idea? Her eyes narrowed in surprise. For a few seconds, she actually seemed to be thinking it over, and suddenly I was too, for a moment. Then I realized I had no answer to this question or any other. So you're for a return to patriarchy? You know I'm not for anything, but at least patriarchy existed. I mean, as a social system, it was able to perpetuate itself. There were families with children, and most of them had children. In other words, it worked, whereas now there aren't enough children, so we're finished. Let's say you're right about patriarchy, that it's the only viable solution. Where does that leave me? I'm studying. I think of myself as an individual person, endowed with the same capacity for reflection and decision-making as a man. Do you really think I'm disposable? The right answer was probably yes, but I kept my mouth shut. Maybe I wasn't as honest as all that. I still didn't want to give her a child, or help out around the house, or buy a baby Bjorn. I didn't even want to fuck her, or maybe I kind of wanted to fuck her, but I also kind of wanted to die. I couldn't really tell. I felt a slight wave of nausea.
Whew, that is so brutal. It's brutally honest. Man, that last line. I mean, and feminism, which is downstream from Christianity, I think
in the sense that in the sort of like individual rights stream of
yes,
that.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that feminism takes a real hit here in this dialogue because, you know, if a belief system can't perpetuate itself, if it's not physically fruitful, then I don't think it can be true. Like, I don't think that true things die and stay dead. They either keep on living or they resurrect. So the idea of women's equality has to find a way to be fruitful and to reconcile itself to motherhood, or it's bogus. That's what I think. And I think the only way that unpaid care work, like motherhood, and women's equal dignity can peacefully coexist is if enough men are virtuous and chivalrous, like if they are Christ-like. Childcare in cooperation with a supportive, involved father is a beautiful and valuable thing. It's not a problem. And a good man can enjoy his wife's cooking and his wife's bed and his wife's brilliant mind and public contributions without seeing those things as mutually exclusive. This is what my husband is like, and all my male family members and my male friends. It's possible. Good men exist. We know them. But in a secularized feminist world, women become equal to men by acting like the worst men. Impregnable, sexually loose, and power-grabbing. In a patriarchal world like what we see in Afghanistan, women become fruitful mothers at the cost of their dignity and equality. Men place them under functional house arrest and treat them like sexual ticking time bombs whose slight glance of the eye or stray hair will make them explode with uncontrollable lust. But in both of these scenarios, barren equality and fruitful inequality, men get away with being their worst selves. And so it's obvious that in this book, Francois is not a good man. He goes from being a porn-addicted womanizer to being a married Muslim patriarch, but he doesn't really change. And at the beginning of the story here, he doesn't want to marry Miriam. He doesn't want to give her children and support those children. He doesn't really respect her intelligence. He only kind of wants to sleep with her. She's a convenient, free vagina. That's it. She's disposable, and he does dispose of her. He lets the relationship fall apart, and she's better off without him. And he should feel nauseous. Over his own relational ineptitude and moral failure. And a man like that shouldn't come within 10 feet of anything like patriarchy because it'll look sick, because he is sick. And men can't help being powerful. They just are physically stronger, period. So men will always hold power, which I think is part of what patriarchy means. But what matters is how they hold it. If a man holds power like Christ in the Christian tradition, if he empties himself for the benefit of others, if he sacrifices himself for their well-being, then that's a man that women can respect. And that creates a world in which women and children can flourish. So I think men are either knights, bullies, or doormats. Like, I think the best vision of masculinity that Christianity has to offer is the vision of strength and service to the weak. And so here I'm going to quote Mark Barnes because he always says things with such a flourish. For there are two ways of making a free man give up his space: enslave him or introduce a mother into it. In this distinction is all of political philosophy, but let us stick with the obvious. Human custom dictates that the presence of pregnancy and motherhood shall motivate and coerce the male frame into opening doors, moving chairs, giving up space, giving more money, excusing mistakes, dispensing with laws, suppressing comments, driving absurd distances to procure cheeseburgers, and otherwise working, however poorly and begrudgingly, to reshape his existence into one of service and self-gift rather than accumulation and self-interest. Men who don't do this suck, and suck obviously. They are cowards. In the real world, women bend male strength towards their needs, even as the child bends female strength towards its own. This is why men are so awkward around pregnant women. Why they feel the need to assert themselves with some horrible cliche. Should you be doing that? You must be doing any time now, etc. Forgive them. They are coping with their own undoing. This transformation of strength into service is the secret of the family, a secret the church would tell to the whole world if they ever had the ears to hear it. Within the family, weakness is strength. The scandal of the family is that the rear end of the child has more de facto power to coerce the bodies of the strong than the supreme reason of the father. All philosophies of strength, be they Greek, Nietzschean, or merely liberal, and here I would add, or Muslim, can be explained by the effort to avoid the diaper. But that we are yet Christian is evident in this. The weight of social opprobrium still falls heaviest on those who would accumulate strength rather than serve weakness. Let adults serve each other instead of children. There you will find, called down like an avenging angel, the full force of the law, of positive statutes here and there, but more importantly, the constraining and coercing law of shame. For what scumbag hurts children? What bastard leaves them? What monster neglects to use what strength he has for their sake? Within Christian societies, weakness is strength, for it demands and obliges the strength of the strong to move on its behalf. Once Christianity is stubbed out like the West's last cigarette, then weakness will be weakness, and life as a woman will be precisely what the Greek philosophers believed it to be: passive, apolitical, deficient, and worthy of being classified alongside the life of children and slaves. So, mic drop.
Totally.
Thank you, Mark Barnes. I wish I'd written it.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
That is a rather ringing endorsement. I joke with my husband all the time that the only parts of Christianity he disagrees with are the theological bits. The rest of his worldview is precisely that of duty, service, wife on a pedestal,
Yes.
etc. Because that was the general culture in which he was raised.
Mm-hmm.
Even if he was raised in an entirely non-religious household with, his parents had a sauna group on Wednesday nights. So it's like, it doesn't matter if, there's what you do in your group and then there's the culture. And it doesn't matter if you get a little, 60s libertini in your own. The culture, it's what's broadcast, it's what's made public that
That's
really determines what rolls.
Yes.
And I think for a lot of people, a virtuous, loving marriage is a recipe for happiness. I'm honestly not sure when we went to a place from religious beliefs shouldn't be the law to a place where we can no longer say children deserve married parents. Instead, we have to skirt around the issue of morality and call it two-parent privilege.
Right.
And so there really is this kind of we know that children have needs, but we're reluctant to attach that cart to the horse of, moral rectitude, which is supposed to pull it.
Exactly.
The liberals want to say, it's someone else's fault that these families can't be intact, or, so the state needs to come in and sort of pull the cart to take care of the children. But honestly, it's not about money. We know that.
Right.
It's not about money.
Right. They try to frame it in terms of strategy or logistics. It'd be so much better if everyone just had two parents, as if it's I don't know, it's a matter of strategy rather than, there's actually morality at the core of that.
Right.
There's moral decision making there.
Yes.
Not just optimization. They use this optimization language.
Or as if money or structures, Charles Marin started Strong Towns. He's always saying that, and I don't think he got this, I don't think he made this up, but this is the idea that you're most communist in your house.
Yes.
And how politics is sort of, some parts of politics can be understood as sort of a misunderstanding of where these ideals are best applied. Because, you know, you can be communist with your family, which is literally to each according to his need, right? Because you're not going to expect the baby to do chores. The baby needs to get what the baby needs just because it needs it.
Exactly.
You can be socialist in your neighborhood, you can share things, but like you go further and further from your group of friends or a group of your community, and you need different rules apply, right?
Yep.
And communism wants to be like, oh, we're gonna get rid of the family, we're gonna be communist at the level of the society. It's like, there's a reason why it doesn't work, because that's not how human beings are. Like, if there are moral structures, you can't substitute them with like cash benefits. Like, that's not how they work.
Right. And I think part of how we end up with sort of like the victimhood culture we have now is the strong serve the weak emphasis, which has to be present in the family for the family to function. It's taking that and extrapolating it way out to places where it doesn't belong, and makes grown adults into functional infants that others have to take care of. You know, or that everybody has to revolve around this certain group, which is sort of classified as the infant who needs its diaper changed. You know what I mean? It's like, so it's not an appropriate way to treat adults. It's like, that's the family value around children. It's not meant like, to go broadly.
The conservatives are like family values, and the liberals are like family values.
Yeah, but in the wrong place.
Family values, but it's like, it's the context.
Right. Family values for family.
Right. Also, I wonder, like, in the context of this book, this question is never really addressed, but you have to wonder what percentage of women in this imaginary France believe that Le Pen was worse than Ben Abbas, the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood Party, in terms of what they had at stake personally.
Right.
Like, did women vote themselves into the veil for fear of the return of Hitler? I mean, that's sort of what the satire is proposing. At least that's my interpretation. I probably have to read the book again, because it's really subtle, and there's a lot of mentioning of like French political characters that
went over me a little
bit about it, but like there's so many people who are mentioned who are obviously either real or real adjacent, like they represent someone who's
else. Real. Yeah, that went past me.
That level, I don't understand French politics enough on that level, but like it's kind of awesome if my reading is correct. There, that's kind of an awesome notion. Because it gets at the sort of like self-immolation of this. Oof. You know, that's what Camus is talking about. I'll say more about that later. But so Francois really exemplifies this notion of female equality as a double-edged sword. Like, yeah, women can study, but meanwhile, the men that they study among, they're nothing like the sexists of old. Like, they're actually worse.
Yeah.
And it's sexual liberation that has made them worse.
Yes.
So you kind of have to wonder. So anyway, so now we need to talk about the forces, because the book has a lot of references to religion. I mean, it's really about religion.
Yes.
All right, so this is he's having dinner with his friend Alain Teneur, who was fired from like one of the state, like I want to say like one of the state security agencies or something.
Yeah.
It's complicated. You want to read this one?
Sure. All right, so this is Alain Teneur talking. The Catholics had all but disappeared in France, Alan was saying, but they still enjoyed a certain moral authority. In any case, from the beginning, Mohammed ben Abbas had done all he could to court them. Unlike his sometime rival Tariq Ramadan, who'd been tainted by his old Trotskyite connections, ben Abbas had kept his distance from the anti-capitalist left. He understood that the pro-growth right had won the war of ideas, but his real stroke of genius was to grasp that elections would no longer be about the economy, but about values, and that here, too, the right was about to win the war of ideas without a fight. Whereas Ramadan presented Sharia as forward-looking, even revolutionary, Ben Abbas restored its reassuring traditional value with a perfume of exoticism that made it all the more attractive. When he campaigned on family values, traditional morality, and by extension, patriarchy, an avenue opened up to him that neither the conservatives nor the National Front could take. Only Ben Abbas was spared. The left, paralyzed by his multicultural background, had never been able to fight him or so much as mention his name. And then Teneur goes on to say that Catholics have nothing to worry about from Muslims coming to power. And I quote, "There's an idea that you hear in far-right circles that if the Muslims came to power, Christians would be reduced to second-class citizens or dhimmis. Now, dhimmitude is part of the general principles of Islam, it's true, but in practice, the status of dhimmis is a very flexible thing. Islam exists all over the world. The way it's practiced in Saudi Arabia has nothing to do with the Islam you find in Indonesia or Morocco. In France, I promise you, they won't interfere with Christian worship. In fact, the government will increase spending for Catholic organizations and the upkeep of churches. For these Muslims, the real enemy, the thing they fear and hate, isn't Catholicism. It's secularism. It's laicism. It's atheist materialism. They think of Catholics as fellow believers. Catholics are one step away from converting to Islam. That's the true original Muslim vision of Christianity.
I love this discussion. It's like, I have two favorite things about Lubeck's presentation of Islam in this book. First, it's just delicious. As I already said this, but I'm going to repeat myself. It's just delicious that he portrays an electorate as being more able to compromise with what can only be viewed as an anti-feminist Islam than it can a French nationalist far right. This is absolutely straight out of Renaud Camus. I'm assuming that Lubeck has read Camus. I don't know that for a fact, but it seems very much in that vein. Mm-hmm. It really exemplifies what Camus talks about under what he calls the second career of Adolf Hitler, which roughly means that any appreciation for the culture that eventually also produced Hitler, so that would be the Christian modern West, mm-hmm. is now permanently suspect. Mm-hmm. Since Hitler believed that in the goodness of his Aryan race, any notion of race, of peoples, of cultures in a Western context is now suspect. Mm-hmm. Which is actually basically the way that woke philosophy reduces everything to oppressed or oppressed. Mm-hmm. That is the mechanism. Nothing in American history can be good because slavery. It's destructively reductive. And I think that Lubeck is doing pure satire here in positing a left so suspicious of its own culture that it believes it is saving itself by destroying itself. Which, of course, doesn't mean that there is much to save. That is the other delicious element, that the French flavor of Islam is depicted as so blatantly against intellectual accomplishments of women. Why poke that bear so hard?
Yeah.
We know from reading about actual women living under an actual Islamic republic, from our episode on reading Lolita in Tehran, mm-hmm. that one of the many permutations of enforced state religion is not prohibiting female instructors, but rather requiring them to comply with female-specific dress and speech codes. Indeed, one of the most surprising elements of that book to me was the fact that even under the Revolution, the author describes the deference she was given even by her male students.
Yeah.
Because the figure of teacher was treated as an authority worthy of respect.
Yes, that was surprising.
So you have to ask yourself, why eliminate women from the university in this imaginary French Islamist state? We just had that quote about how Islam is capable of dealing with local variation.
Yes.
So why do it? Mm-hmm. And I think the answer has to be in service of this satire.
Yeah.
It is a statement of how exhausted the postmodern, post-liberal order is that it does not even recognize the differences between its own conservative past and this entirely other tradition. Yeah. It is so exhausted, the only way forward seems to be a kind of unprincipled submission. And just how unprincipled we will see later.
Yes. Yeah, this quote brings this up. It's an interesting question. Is Catholicism closer to Islam or closer to secularism? Within the framework of the story, the Muslim politicians see Catholicism as non-threatening, as, fellow believers with traditional moral values, more likely to be partners than competitors. But where the similarity really breaks down, frankly, is in their different view of women, their different treatment of women, at least within the context of the story, right? Catholicism and Christianity in general recognizes women's equality and dignity, women's potential in both the public and the private spheres of life. The Christian emphasis on monogamy and the development of the chivalric tradition of romantic love, both of those emphasize the woman as an equal peer, or even as above the man, demanding his total allegiance. And a lot of that's connected with the tradition of medieval Marian devotion.
Introduce a mother.
Exactly. Introduce a mother into it.
Literally.
That's exactly right. And Christianity learned how to work with its New Testament teachings on, quote unquote, wifely submission in a creative way that largely takes the teeth out of what could be a very sexist practice. And what looks sexist on the page, and probably was in the past, has been transformed by the rest of Christian theology into something loving and dignified and equal. And I speak from personal experience here. There's nothing better than a good Christian marriage or a self-sacrificial Christian husband who puts his wife on a pedestal. And so in this sense, feminism is downstream from Christianity, for better and for worse. She's our grandbaby. So while it's true that Islam and Catholicism are both monotheistic and share, family values, I know what kind of family I want to be a part of. Christian patriarchy and Muslim patriarchy are not the same. And then there's a complicating factor that secularism is itself the child of Catholicism, right? It starts in Christ's words in the Gospel according to Luke, where he's asked whether the Jews should pay taxes to Caesar, and he says, "Show me a coin. Whose face is on it?" Well, Caesar's. Okay, well then, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and render to God what is God's. In other words, render your heart, right? Because each person is made in God's image. We're like a coin stamped with the face of God, so we owe him ourselves, right? That's our tribute. But that doesn't mean that human government doesn't have its own proper sphere of authority, its own subsidiary layer of competence and decision making that's proper to it. In the Christian tradition, God values our freedom as individuals and as peoples. We get to make our own choices and organize ourselves as we see fit. So law and theology aren't wedded together. Government and religion aren't the same because there has to be room for personal conscience and for gendered probity and for cultural expression. And the Christian God doesn't require sort of a one-size-fits-all approach. And that's the seed of what eventually becomes secularity and tolerance and religious freedom, right? So Christianity as empire is kind of a bastardization of itself, because those two things are fundamentally opposed. Christ didn't found an empire. He was murdered by an empire. And to quote Paul Kingsnorth, I saw that the teachings of Christ were the most radical in history and that no empire could be built by those who truly lived them. And I saw that we had arrived here in the messed up state of the world as it is because we do not live them. Or as Illich would say, of Christianity giving birth to the modern world, the corruption of the best is the worst. And it sounds to me like Tanvir's description of the different forms of Islam in different countries mirrors this secular freedom a little bit. But that sounds more like the Islam of the High Middle Ages and the Ottoman Empire.
Sounds like the Romans, tolerating local practices.
Exactly. But that doesn't sound sort of like the more modern, fundamentalist, Islamist, jihad style of Islam that I hear more about these days. I don't want to compare the best of Christianity to the worst of Islam, or the Christian ideal to the Muslim real. That's not fair. So, I acknowledge my ignorance about this. So I don't really know how to square that circle. But I'm still more inclined to see Catholicism and secularity as being related than to see Catholicism and Islam as being related. Particularly when it comes to women and freedom of conscience. Give me post-Christian secularity, even atheism over Islam. The atheists are Christian grandbabies too. They still share many of our moral instincts, even if they don't admit where they get them from.
My husband,
yeah, right. And so I'm give me Ivan Karamazov over Muhammad any day. Yeah.
So, one thing I'm obsessed with is the notion of the feminization of institutions. I feel like this book, especially with the sort of idea that they want to make the university all male again, is really much in this vein.
Oh, that it's poking at they've become
these
so feminized.
Consequences in the sort of, wormholes that the mainstream media doesn't touch. One of the currents going through there is the effect that increasing institutional dominance by women is having on institutions, and then how it affects men. I sent you an article the other day about how no one wants to talk about how the reason that young men are increasingly turning away from college is because it is now viewed as an institution, as a female institution. And the numbers have it that way. It's 60-40 basically.
Yeah.
So now men look at it and think, oh, the university is for girls. And this isn't sexism, at least not the way we traditionally think of it.
Right.
It's a sense of thwarted belongingness.
Yeah.
Men, just as women do, feel and seek belongingness among their own sex.
Yeah.
This is just a fact of human civilization. One, of course, that is having a bit of a hard time, where we were taught, we learned that being sex blind was morally akin to being race blind.
Oh, yeah.
So it's but of course, it isn't. Sex is not equivalent to race.
That's right.
And so now we're all the poorer for it, because many institutions, like those designed around the notions of rigor and merit, are being dismantled in the name of inclusion. Problem is, we still need excellence.
Yes.
And there's a relationship between, how you get excellence and, sex specificity. So, indeed, the original feminist argument was never include us because we were women, but rather do not exclude us because we are not men. So and the difference there is that, you let a woman who can sort of thrive in a male-dominated institution,
right, play ball with the boys.
You let her do that because what you're going for is the excellence.
Right.
And of course, men did object on the grounds of, I mean, there was a lot of sexism, like, you know, the famous stories of, you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg being in law school and being told by her professors that she's taking a place away from a man. Like, there is that kind of sexism. But at least in that model, there wasn't the sort of like, oh, you know, if law school isn't 50-50, it means we're discriminating.
Right.
Those are two totally different mindsets.
Yes.
And the correct argument is do not exclude us because we are not men. But if you're going to go that way, you have to accept this means that many careers and disciplines will never be sex equal.
Right.
Because that's just not the temperament, talents. Like, some of these things are, like, temperament is generally, there is a distribution.
Yeah.
There are attributes that tend to occur more in men.
Right. Yeah. Just
There are attributes
agreeableness.
that occur more in women.
Mm-hmm.
But we've convinced ourselves that any inequality now implies sexism, when it may actually just be acknowledging the reality of physical, temperamental, and preference differences.
Yeah.
And so in the context of this book, what caught my attention was the idea that the culture of Middle Ages was a homosocial culture that was feminized in a totally different way.
Yes.
It was feminized by a devotion to the Virgin Mary. So it's sort of like, in terms of feminization, the corruption of the best is the worst.
Yes.
We've taken away the sort of, you know, directing all this specifically homosocial male energy at the veneration of one woman, and now it's just sort of descended into this. If you look at the priesthood, which Catholic priesthood, like, the way I like to look at it, the anachronism, that it's the present anachronism that applies the missing past anachronism, because you have to imagine that there was an equally powerful all-female domain equivalent to that,
right,
which was basically medicine.
Huh.
Yeah, that's what it was. And unfortunately, ironically, the church itself is mixed up into the undoing of all that.
Right, and making it into a professionalized male domain.
Or just getting rid of all that female knowledge, like, because it's so powerful. But the idea is that, like, people who object to the male priesthood, it's like, no, you're objecting to the wrong thing. The problem isn't that that's all male.
Right.
The problem is that the all-female domain is now gone.
Right. Well, and it got literally demonized by women being called witches.
Yes.
And so much of that female in the female circle of medicinal practice got, literally the witch hunts.
Yes.
It got rid of it.
They basically destroyed the equivalent to it.
Yeah.
Which is not great. But it's like, all male institutions aren't the problem. It's that there needs to be, the equivalent used to be there. And now, I mean, when they say, like, oh, you know, this is women's work, it just misses out on the whole fact that it really used to be that there were some exclusive domains of women that everybody needed that nobody could get to except through a woman.
Right. And they were respected.
Right, because it was understood that they were very powerful. And now with technology, it's like, it's had a very asymmetrical effect, right?
Yes.
Technology has really demolished. We can't imagine the idea of an institution of medicine being only all those technologies being exclusively controlled by women. Mm-hmm. But that was actually, that would be the feeling.
Wow.
That would be the feeling. Mm-hmm. We almost can't imagine what we lost because we're just so conditioned to understand. We don't have a mystical understanding of health and medicine anymore, whereas, like, we have a mystical understanding of religion. That's what at least religious people do. That's the equivalent of what it would have felt like.
Wow, that's so interesting.
And you can see its reflection in this sort of kind of feminization where men are devoted to Mary.
Yeah. Yeah, so we'll move on to this quote then. Positive versus negative feminization, or porn versus pilgrimage. So Tanure encourages Francois to go to, how do you say this? Rocamadour, a small cliff-top village in south-central France. It is known for its complex of religious buildings, accessed via the Grand Escalier staircase of 216 steps.
Do you know what the 216 is about?
No, do you?
I think that's a number that is
like some
Catholic
biblical
thing.
significance?
It has to be.
I don't know.
Because I think that, if I remember correctly, the cross thing that we went to in Austria, the big cross building, also had
216. Oh, we gotta look that up.
I'm
curious.
Show notes.
So Rocamadour, it includes the Chapelle Notre Dame with its Black Madonna statue carved of walnut in the 12th century. So here's the quote. This is Tanure talking again. All right.
Yeah.
The French Revolution, the Republic, the motherland, yes, all that paved the way for something that lasted a little more than a century. The Christian Middle Ages lasted a millennium and more. No one grasped the soul of medieval Christianity as deeply as Péguy, for all his republicanism, his secularism, his support of Dreyfus. And he understood that the true divinity of the Middle Ages, the beating heart of its devotion, wasn't God the Father, wasn't even Jesus Christ. It was the Virgin Mary. That, too, you can feel at Rocamadour. And so Francois goes, and he falls into the habit of visiting the chapel of Our Lady. And this is back in his perspective. Every day I went and sat for a few minutes before the Black Virgin, the same one who for 1,000 years inspired so many pilgrimages, before whom so many saints and kings had knelt. It was a strange statue. It bore witness to a vanished universe. The Virgin sat rigidly erect, her head, with its eyes closed, so distant that it seemed extraterrestrial, was crowned by a diadem. I remembered a conversation I'd had years before with a history professor at the Sorbonne. In the early Middle Ages, he'd explained, the question of individual judgment barely came up. Only much later, with Hieronymus Bosch, for example, do we see those terrifying images in which Christ separates the cohort of the chosen from the legion of the damned. The Romanesque vision was much more communal. At his death, the believer fell into a deep sleep and was laid in the earth. When all the prophecies had been fulfilled and Christ came again, it was the entire Christian people who rose together from the tomb, resurrected in one glorious body to make their way to paradise. Moral judgment, individuality itself were not clear ideas in the mind of the Romanesque man, and I felt my own individuality dissolving the longer I sat in my reverie before the Virgin of Rocamadour. And he almost has a deeply religious experience.
Yes!
Almost, right? He's about to. And he happens upon the chapel during a reading of Péguy and is nearly moved. Here it says, the baby Jesus seemed ready to detach himself from her, and it seemed to me that all he had to do was raise his right hand, and the pagans and idolaters would be destroyed, and the keys to the world restored to him as its Lord, its possessor, and its master. But the moment passes. Or maybe I was just hungry.
Just like, and I felt a little nauseous.
Right, yeah. And the next morning, his last, he ends up, quote, in my pew, shriveled and puny, fully deserted by the Spirit.
Sad, right?
So sad, almost.
So, in this example, it is the sheer ubiquity of the iconography of the Virgin Mary that imprints that millennium. Right, an effect doubtless all the more salient considering that the men and women would not have spent nearly so much of their lives in close contact with one another, as so many activities were segregated by sex.
Right.
It's very tempting to think of this as a kind of positive feminization of male society. It allows men to venerate women, or woman in general, yet without breaking down traditional gendered activities. While there are, of course, only trade-offs, no solutions, and I'm not advocating a return to the 12th century,
Right.
I think it's important to point out that the feminization of institutions is a real issue now in our society, and a significant portion of men seem to sense a need for male belongingness in order to motivate themselves to pursue activities.
Yeah.
Liberals do not want to talk about this because it seems to contradict 150 years of feminism, of progress. Most people actually do take for granted the notion that women earn less simply because they are discriminated against for being female, or that the reason certain jobs and our fields are dominated by men is against sexism. And while sexism always has and always will exist in co-ed workspaces, it is probably past time that we acknowledge that choices based on what the field will be like, given its popularity with men or women, absolutely plays a role.
Sure.
It's too simple to say that men will grow to despise something simply because it is associated with women, thus giving evidence that they are sexist pigs. Yes, some men are sexist pigs, but the fact that no one even bothers to say a woman doctor or woman lawyer anymore, something that was still true when I was a kid, I remember it, makes me think we need to reconsider this notion. It isn't sexist to enjoy being with and competing against your own kind.
Right.
It is not male sexism to want or to enjoy single-sex spaces. Indeed, it used to be quite normal. We can derive this as patriarchy or the rule of the old boys club, but we're starting to see receipts that institutions change, and not always for the better, especially for men, when they are dominated by women.
Yeah.
I think there's a symbolic diptych to be explored here, in the contrast between a society dominated by male political power, itself dominated by the Virgin Mary, and a society of female liberation, where the main activity now common to men is the consumption of pornography.
Oof.
The violent and sexual denigration of probably tens of thousands of anonymous women.
Yeah.
So this activity, not the veneration of an icon, is now offered as proof of male belongingness, of normality. Here's the quote. This is Francois ruminating on his sexual problems. Had I fallen prey in middle age to a kind of andropause? And again, like, that language is so... Right, that is the language that comes from our society of egalitarianness, which says that something that comes on to the, like, it's menopause, but andropause. It's like,
right.
Let's
There's
take
no such
everything
thing.
we know about one sex and find an equivalent in the other sex.
Apply it to the other.
Very pointed.
Yeah.
Had I fallen prey in middle age to a kind of andropause, it wouldn't have surprised me. To find out for sure, I decided to spend my evenings on YouPorn, which over the years had grown into a sort of porn encyclopedia. The results were immediate and extremely reassuring. YouPorn catered to the fantasies of normal men all over the world, and within minutes it became clear that I was an utterly normal man. I knew not to take this for granted. I mean, that is pure satire. That is pure satire.
That makes me feel nauseous.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it really is, feminism has harped for ages on this Madonna-whore dichotomy as symbolic of the patriarchy. Like, if you weren't the perfect Christian woman, you were nothing but a harlot.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure that rhetoric still exists in these kind of unfortunate circles of, Tradwifery or whatever.
Oh yeah, it's still there.
I'm sure it's still there. But the feminist solution, like the solution of the culture that I grew up in, was to tear down the Christian order that made this possible. Yeah. So first, bye-bye religious sexual mores, right? The church can't tell me what to do. But then it expanded into this whore positivity thing, right? Literally, leftists, the same leftists who throw around the word TERF, there's also one for being against prostitution. Like, leftists accuse many anti-prostitution advocates, like Julie Bindel is a classic example of whorephobia.
Oh, gosh.
So, like, they get rid of... the leftists, they would have it that there are no longer any whores, just sex workers in a free market, right?
Yeah.
But over and above these feminist illusions, the problem is that the Madonna is not just a symbol of power. She's an icon. And you can't destroy the human need for an icon.
Exactly.
I don't think you can.
Yeah.
So guess what the icon is now? What is the shared icon that all men see on a daily basis? Pornography.
Porn. Okay.
It's normal.
It's normal.
And it will get worse.
That's right. So this is a topic that fascinates me, this idea that the beating heart of devotion in the Middle Ages was to the Virgin Mary. And because as Francois notices when he's looking at the Black Madonna, it, quote, bears witness to a vanished universe. Like you said before, that the past is a foreign country, and that's definitely true in the realm of iconography and Marian devotion. We're modern Americans descended from Puritans and Jews who feared idolatry more than anything else, right? Like our ancestors were allergic to iconodulia, to the veneration of icons. And yet, one of the best afternoons you and I spent together was at the Met.
Icon feast.
Yeah, exactly. Like wandering through the medieval art galleries looking at Mary. She was everywhere, and wherever we saw her, she was always with Jesus. Either Jesus was in her womb, or she was holding him in her lap, or nursing him, or standing at the foot of the cross, or she was holding his corpse in the Pietas scene, or being crowned by him in heaven. But wherever she was, he was there too.
Well, sometimes it's just the words of the Annunciation.
Yes, that's right.
Sort of like the exception that proves the rule.
Exactly. Yeah. That's part of what fascinates me about Mary as this high, holy, and ubiquitous feminine symbol is that she's always in relation to the masculine figure of Christ, but she's never sexual, right? Like she's the maiden, the mother, and the matriarch, but the one thing she is not is the whore.
Absolutely.
Right? She's like a mental palate cleanser for men, right? She's like the perfect opposite of looking at porn. And part of why, Stella Maris, the star of the sea, shines so brightly in the Middle Ages is because she was lauded as a perpetual virgin, untouched by man, totally devoted to God. And sometimes she's called like the spouse of the Holy Spirit or the bride of God. And I think that's what her, perpetual virginity symbolizes, is that as if she were married to God in a way, like rather than to any man. So the virginity symbolizes the total devotion to God. So iconographically, she's depicted as like the Ark of the Covenant, which no human person was supposed to touch.
Oh, interesting.
Or the Holy of Holies, which no person was supposed to enter except the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. And breaking those rules, like touching the untouchable holiness that houses the Word of God, means that you literally die. right? So Mary's perfect submission to God in her famous fiat, like, behold, I am the servant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word. That sets her above all men and makes her off limits to all men, right? As if she were married to God. And that's why she is always this singular symbol of the collective church, which in the New Testament is also referred to as the bride of Christ, right? She's like the face, the icon of the church. And so why does Mary matter for Francois and for France and for us as moderns? And I'm going to quote Neil Postman for this. He said, "A metaphor is not an ornament. It's an organ of perception. Through metaphors, we see the world as one thing or another." And now, I believe more things about Mary than the average person. But I think we can all agree that Mary, as the Black Virgin statue, as the medieval Madonna, is at least an extremely potent metaphor. And that means she is an organ of perception. Like, we can see the world in a certain way through her. We can perceive what women are and what they can be through her. So I wanted to recite a section from something I came across this year called the Litany of Loreto, which will give listeners a taste of what I'm talking about, that poetic symbols generate perception. Holy Mother of God, Holy Virgin of Virgins, Mother of Christ, Mother of the Church, Mother of Mercy, Mother undefiled, Mother most amiable, Mother admirable, Mother of good counsel, Mother of our Creator, Mother of our Savior, Virgin most prudent, Virgin most venerable, Virgin most renowned, Virgin most powerful, Virgin most merciful, Virgin most faithful, Mirror of justice, Seat of wisdom, Cause of our joy, Spiritual vessel, Vessel of honor, Singular vessel of devotion, Mystical rose, Tower of David, Tower of ivory, House of gold, Ark of the covenant, Gate of heaven, Morning star, Health of the sick, Refuge of sinners, Solace of migrants, Comfort of the afflicted, Help of Christians, Queen of angels, Queen of patriarchs, Queen of prophets, Queen of apostles, Queen of martyrs, Queen of confessors, Queen of virgins, Queen of all saints. And it goes on and on and on. And she comes to represent all that is holy in creation, like the goodness of the material world, the possibility that frail human beings could actually be divinized and become radiant, like a mortal human could become a home for God. And this is why Mary is the pattern for all people and like a vaccine against idolatry. Because you can either bear God or you can try to be God. Like, if you're not making space within yourself to receive him, then wittingly or unwittingly, you're trying to take his place. Like, those are the two choices. That's why she's so important. And so to lose the metaphor of Mary is to lose an eye, right? It's to see less beauty, to see less of reality. And Francois has this beautiful reverie, this time of silent meditation in the presence of Mary and of Christ, and his individuality starts to dissolve, which for him means that his loneliness and his self-absorption start to dissolve. And he has this possible moment of conversion, kind of melting into the body of Christ across the ages, but he loses it. He snaps out of it. His perception shrinks again, and he goes back to being his shriveled, puny self. And he loses the vision of Mary, which is the vision of woman as the dignified crown of creation, and the kind of woman that he could bend the knee before. And his vision reverts back to seeing women as the kind of beings that are just there for him to bend over in bed. He goes back to his whores.
He really does.
He does.
We're leaving so much of that out. You're welcome.
Yeah, there's a lot in it that made me feel nauseous. I'll say. And as we'll read in the next quote, this view of women as only good for one thing, which is what his secular libertine culture taught him, is not actually challenged by the version of Islam seen in the book.
Exactly.
Right, like only this ancient form of Christianity and Marian devotion rebuked his pornographic view of women. But the Islam within the book affirms his hypersexualized view of them. Sure, he has to end up getting married to convert to Islam, but he doesn't actually have to change his view of women. Like, his debauched, roue self isn't repented of and washed away. It's given the stamp of approval. It's justified. Like, the possibility within Islam, as the book presents it, for polygamy and for this huge age gap permitted in marriage, like a father-daughter style age gap, like she's 15 and he's 50, like, both of those things encourage the woman to be treated less like a peer and companion and more like an adjunct to the man, more like a servant. And I think that's degrading. Like, if you're one of multiple and you're way younger, that is not a proper dynamic for anything approaching equal dignity between men and women.
Yeah, I mean, also given like underage is like one of the major porn categories. I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
I mean, this is.
Ooh, I
This
had
is-
thought of that.
We can't.
Oh.
We're not making any statements about Islam in France or Islam as a religion, but in this book, Islam really is portrayed as the refuge of the libertine.
Yes.
And this is the most. I think this next one is the most shocking part of the book for me. It really is pornographizing the submission to God.
Yes.
Talk about the corruption of the best is the worst. Like,
Yeah.
there's no worse thing you could do to it.
Right.
It's almost like
Right.
atheism was bad, but this is worse.
Right. Oof. Yeah.
So they're at Rediger's house, which is, I think, one of his older. It's some sort of. I think they have an academic connection.
Mm-hmm.
They're discussing his conversion to Islam. Rediger's already converted, and he mentions that in the quote he compares it to Story of O, which is a story basically about a woman's degradation into a BDSM sex slave for an elite club of men. It's about as sick as you can imagine. I don't think either of us are going to bother reading.
I'm not going to read that.
And Rediger himself has embraced this kind of. He has a 40-year-old wife to be his good little cook, and a 15-year-old wife for whatever else. So, and he makes this comparison about converting to Islam with this, I guess we could say, pornographic story. It's submission, Rediger murmured, the shocking and simple idea which has never been so forcefully expressed, that the summit of human happiness resides in the most absolute submission. I hesitate to discuss the idea with my fellow Muslims, who might consider it sacrilegious, but for me there's a connection between women's submission to man, as it's described in Story of O, and the Islamic idea of man's submission to God. You see, he went on, Islam accepts the world and accepts it whole. It accepts the world as such, Nietzsche might say. For Buddhism, the world is dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, suffering. Christianity has serious reservations of its own. Isn't Satan called the prince of the world? For Islam, though, the divine creation is perfect. It's an absolute masterpiece. What is the Quran, really, but one long mystical poem of praise for the Creator and of submission to His laws? So, it turns out, I'm going to tell you it gets worse, right? Story of O was actually written by a woman on a dare. Her lover did not believe a woman could write in the manner of the Marquis de Sade. Well, she accepted the challenge and basically just wrote a disgusting book of odalisques, that's the O in the title, willing self-abasement and life of sexual abuse, which ends in her, again, willing death. If you've read any Sade, that will cover it. And if you haven't, well, I don't recommend it. I literally had, I read some of Sade, I read some of Justine for my dissertation, and
Really?
walked around, for a week.
Oh.
This is morally sick.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. That's the thing that we have to understand. This thought current is not new. It's old. It's just, it's just where is it in culture? Where does it reside? Where is it kept? I'm not in favor of banning books.
Right.
But I'm in favor of making judicious decisions about, how they're promoted, who should read them, when they should read them, how seriously we should take those ideas.
Yeah.
So who better to call on in our hour of need here?
Bring it.
Bring it. We're going to go back to Andrea Dworkin to sum up. She wrote there's in the collection that we actually used when we did an episode on her, she wrote a little piece about Story of O, and she's going to sum it up for us. Story of O is a story of psychic cannibalism, demonic possession, a story which posits men and women as being at opposite poles of the universe, the survival of one dependent on the absolute destruction of the other. It asks, like many stories, who is the most powerful, and it answers, men are, literally over women's dead bodies. That's a good takeaway quote, but most relevant is that Dworkin clearly sees in the story the male fantasy of power without effort, without trial. Manhood without the trials required by the process of maturity. So just like Francois, O's male torturers are left untouched, unchanged. This is Dworkin again. What occurs at Rossi is this clear perversion of real initiation. Renee and the others mutilate O's body, but they are themselves untouched. Her body substitutes for their bodies. O is marked with the scars that they should bear. She undergoes their ordeal for them, endures the solitude and isolation, the torture, the mutilation. In trying to become gods, they have bypassed the necessary rigors of becoming men. The men of Rossi never, in fact, become men. They are never initiates. Never achieve the security of realized manhood.
Wow.
So let's hear that again from the quote from Submission. This is Francois' academic friend. For me, there's a connection between women's submission to man, as is described in Story of O, and the Islamic idea of man's submission to God. I mean, wow. I mean, again, I think this has to be part of the satire.
Yeah.
It's proposing sexualized debasement and cruelty as the primary metaphor for man's obedience to God.
That's sick.
I don't think this is a statement about Islam. I think this is a statement about how exhausted Christianity has become to these French men who are happy to give up anything as long as they can keep their sexual libertinism. And that it takes place in the context of polygamy or pornography makes no difference, effectively. Yeah. These men stand for nothing. They utter the phrases given to them to convert, just like Francois will soon do in the book, and they are happy not to be asked for anything.
That's right.
They epitomize, as I believe Lubeck intends them to, the death of Christian Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, pornography's gross, but like the idea that man has a pornographied relationship to God is like,
right.
It's equally gross.
To submit to God is to be raped,
yes.
Basically. It's like, that is the most sick, twisted, inverted sort of icon you can think of.
Right.
Yeah. Faith as rape. You're like, what?
Like, there's no model anymore. Like, the exhaustion is at the level of they can't imagine submission or weakness in any other context besides that of the mistreatment of women. I mean, that's what the pornographic comparison is. It's like, it's to be an object rather than to be abject. The idea of that distance is supposed to create reverence because it's like something so great made you.
Yes.
It's not one of degradation. It's not.
No.
Like, it's the difference between reverence and degradation. That's basically where we are with this.
Right. Right. And the attitude that recognizes the reverence will say, like with the psalmist, or this idea of like, I am dust and to dust I will return. It's like, but you're saying it of yourself in humility. Like, he lasts forever.
Right.
I'm a breath.
Right. The difference is the material you are cannot last forever, but the breath that was put into you, I mean, that's the primary metaphor of, the Old Testament is, breathing into the dirt, the earth.
Right. Into the hummus, into the human.
Into the...
Yeah.
So that distance is that's not derogatory. If anything, it's the opposite, because this idea of taking something so, like, that all of us perceive as humble and, just because we walk on the dirt. I mean, we live we walk on the dirt, and the idea that, like, we are but a lifted up version of the dirt we walk on.
Right. But the whole story of both the Old and New Testament is that, amazingly, like, God loves dirt. He makes people out of dirt to love, right?
Right.
And then the proper response is then awe.
Exactly.
Right. Awe and reverence and being overcome. Right. But that's the response to love. And so whatever Rediger is talking about here is just, it's literally like the demonic opposite of that. And so...
And he kind of knows that, right? He's like, I hesitate to share this with my Muslim friends.
It's totally sacrilegious. Yeah.
The satire is just so deep here. Do you want to read this last quote, or you just want to...
Yeah, we'll do the last one. We're almost done here. All right, so later, after Francois' conversion to Islam, he reflects on what it will be like to hit on his female students in the fall. See, he's no different.
He really isn't.
Now, not as potential serial lovers, but as potential wives. A few months later, there would be new classes and new students. Pretty, veiled, shy. I don't know how students find out which teachers are famous, but they always inevitably did. And I didn't think things could be so different now. Each of these girls, no matter how pretty, would be happy and proud if I chose her, and would feel honored to share my bed. They would be worthy of love, and I, for my part, would come to love them. Rather like my father a few years before, I'd be given another chance, and it would be the chance at a second life, with very little connection to the old one. I would have nothing to mourn.
That's the cherry on top, right? Very little connection to the old one.
Uh-huh.
But it's the same as the old one.
It's the same.
And I'm the last person to argue that the antidote to exhausted Christianity is like top-down Christian nationalism. I'm very against that. But I think this book wants us to ask ourselves the question of what comes next by presenting this dark satire of one possibility of surrender.
Yeah.
I think the book is demanding that we reckon with our culture. Because otherwise we're likely to simply take its worst fruits, sexual libertism and the objectification of women, and smuggle them into, as a sort of sad consolation prize, the culture of our replacers.
Yeah.
I mean, the only remnant of the Christian West that will remain will be, in a nutshell, the Marquis de Sade. As affirmed by a woman! I mean, I'm sorry to be so dark on this beautiful Sunday, but like... Yeah. There is nothing inherent in us that prevents us from going to the bottom.
Right.
You know?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is so dark. I mean, both Rediger and Francois are trapped in this moral blindness that comes, I think, from dispensing with the Christian intuition that the world is fallen and broken and not as it should be. You know, as long as men recognize and believe that there's something wrong with the way things are, they'll be susceptible to recognizing that there's something wrong with the way I am, right? They'll be susceptible to repentance. But men who recognize that they need to repent are going to hold their power a little more circumspectly, I think. Otherwise,
you achieve that though in an age where we're being told, like, it really, those two things we've been talking about, like the porn replacing the icons, it really dovetails. Like, it really is about this idea of, like, you know, are we a body? Are we a human body? Are we one human body to be redeemed? I mean, the Israelites in the desert aren't worried about, like, and me personally, am I going to be redeemed? They're like, are we as a people going to be redeemed? So it really is that, like, individualism is a danger.
Yeah.
I mean, we've made so many strides based on this notion of individual rights, but at the same time, there's a double-edged sword there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, in the West, we became possessed with this principle of, like, do no harm, you know, which that's applied primarily to words and feelings
and
now.
And it is very individualistic.
Very individualistic,
too.
Right. And it's not about, is the group harmed? It's about me personally, my feelings. Right. So take that principle with the principle of women's equality as interchangeability with men, and combine that with a vision of human rights that includes sexual proclivities as an identity. Those things together contributed to the erosion of stigma against sexual exploitation and sexual depravity. We forgot this idea that the fall affects our sexual desires. You know, so when destigmatization reaches its climax, so to speak, and the only rule is consent, that's how you wind up with two men discussing the story of O as if it contained some religious mystery at the heart of the universe.
Yes, that is well said.
Like Illich always said, the corruption of the best is the worst. Or like G.K. Chesterton said, the modern world is full of Christian virtues cut loose from one another and wandering wildly as extreme versions of themselves and doing terrible damage. And it's the virtues that are doing terrible damage when they're isolated. So the exhausted Christianity that these men represent was born from a universal misapplication over the past century of all the ways that Christ scandalized the religious conservatives of his day. Right? So the Good Samaritan story, his conversation with the woman at the well, protecting the woman caught in adultery from being stoned, his sharing meals with tax collectors and prostitutes, which is actually a message of forgiveness for wrongdoing and welcoming those on the margin. This gets weaponized and turned into pride parades and don't kink shame and love is love and rainbow flags on churches, you know, which designate those churches as safe spaces where no one's sexual behavior will be questioned, including heterosexuals.
Well, primarily heterosexuals,
right.
So facto, because heterosexuals are the vast majority of human beings.
Everybody, exactly. You know, and so we've talked about this before, the idea that promiscuous straight people are just using gay rights as a cover for their own misdeeds. It's like taking the rainbow flag as a permission slip that signals, we don't criticize your sex life here, do whatever you want, you know? And so after the sexual revolution, the exhausted Christianity of the West forgets how to put women on a pedestal, I think. And so you end up with a situation where educated men are contemplating the poetic nature of putting women under their feet. And so to quote Mark Barnes, these men suck, and suck obviously. They are cowards. Don't suck, listeners.
Don't suck. I mean, oh God, yeah. There is a conflict. If pornography is ubiquitous and his relations demand nothing of him in terms of respect, and, you know, he can call hookers to his house and do all sorts of gross things to them, like, if that is his day-to-day, then of course when Miriam's like, don't you think of me as an individual worthy of respect, of course the answer is going to be no.
Right.
Because if it were yes, imagine the cognitive dissonance that would be required for that.
Right.
That's the thing that I just don't think liberals understand. It's like that yoga teacher, that I had. It's like your most frequent thought becomes your most present reality. And I worry about this too. I mean, if men are watching porn all the time and you're in the office with a man, like, that's going to change the way that those men look at you.
Looking at an icon as an organ of perception, you're teaching your heart, you're training your heart to love and to respond to certain things.
Yes.
You're pornifying your view of all women by looking at any woman in porn.
Yes.
Right. Just like in looking at an icon of Mary or in looking at beautiful art or in looking, I don't know. There are many other beautiful things to look at that could generate reverence and respect for women, but porn is not one of them.
I mean, I don't believe that porn is speech, but that's a different issue. We've talked about that. Mm-hmm. But like, we literally live in an age where we consider it a fundamental right, as it should be, to sort of, think your own thoughts, speak your own beliefs, look at what you want to look at. But we can still not ban like Sod from the library, but we can also still have a discussion about like, what do we want our world to look like?
Yeah. We
can still make judicious choices. I believe strongly in the sort of persuasion.
Yes. Yeah. And I think we fundamentally misunderstand what the freedoms that we have are for. My understanding is the freedom is for freedom of conscience to operate, not freedom for appetite. Those are completely different. I'm not free to pursue all appetites I want, regardless of what they do to me or to other people. It's freedom for conscience, which means your conscience is functioning and maybe your conscience moves you differently than the conscience of another person. And so you respect one another's conscience. I am under no obligation to respect other people's appetites. And others are not, bound to respect my appetites, but they have to respect my conscience. This is so different. But we just say freedom and it covers the whole thing. It's like,
in fact, I think it only really means now. I mean, maybe that is that is why you can use the same rhetoric, and we are recording this like 2 days before the election. Mm-hmm. That is why you can use the same rhetoric of freedom and have it mean two totally different things on the right and the left.
Yes.
I do think that you're onto something there. That is an excellent way of framing the difference. Because allowing freedom of conscience has a very different consequence from allowing freedom of appetites.
So much so. Yeah, and to respect someone's freedom of conscience is to say you're a person too. You have this functioning conscience and consciousness that's working and trying to interpret the world and under the assumption you are trying to do what's right. You're trying to access reality and live in accordance with reality and do as you see best and as you see fit. It's a very respectful thing to recognize the freedom of someone else's conscience. But freedom of appetite is like recognizing that in someone else and like trying to honor that is like, well, animals have appetites too. Animals don't have conscience. It's like, it's just not on the same plane.
Have we even talked about what we're doing next time? Vaguely. We have some thoughts. We have ideas.
Mm-hmm. I don't think we have a book yet.
I don't think we've picked for sure, though.
Yeah. We'll let you know.
All right, well, stay tuned. You know where to find us.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.